My aunt tried stealing my inheritance by calling Grandma incompetent, but we'd emailed proof. The court clerk handed me the motion for competency evaluation like she was passing me a menu at a diner. I read it twice before my brain actually processed what I was looking at. My Aunt Diane was petitioning to have my grandmother declared mentally incompetent, with herself listed as the proposed conservator. The filing was 43 pages long. I felt my stomach drop when I saw the date too. She'd filed it 6 weeks ago, and this was the first I'd heard about it. 6 weeks of legal maneuvering, and Gran had no idea she was being characterized as a delusional old woman who couldn't remember her own name. The clerk cleared her throat. "Sir, the hearing is scheduled for Monday. That's 4 days from now." I looked up at her, and she must have seen something in my face because she softened. "You might want to get a lawyer." I'd been living 3 blocks from Gran for the past 2 years, visiting her every Sunday for dinner without fail. She was 78, sharp as a knife, and ran her life with the kind of precision that made military logistics look casual. She had a pill organizer that she filled every Saturday night, a calendar on her fridge where she tracked every doctor's appointment and bridge club meeting, and a financial system that would make an accountant weep with joy. Her house was immaculate. Her mind was clearer than mine on most days. And yet, according to this document, she was supposedly wandering around, confused, unable to manage her affairs, possibly a danger to herself. The motion cited concerning incidents and observable cognitive decline, and the professional opinion of family members with medical training. That last part made me pause. Diane was a dental hygienist. She cleaned teeth for a living, and suddenly she was a medical expert on dementia. The backstory was simple, or at least I'd thought it was. My grandfather had passed away 14 months earlier, leaving Gran with the house, the savings, and a modest but comfortable pension. He'd worked for the Postal Service for 37 years, and they'd lived frugally enough to build something solid. The inheritance wasn't massive, maybe $400,000 in total assets, with the house paid off, and about $150,000 in cash and investments. Gran had been clear about her wishes. She'd updated her will 6 months after Grandpa died, sitting down with a lawyer downtown and spelling everything out. She'd shown me the document herself, walking me through each provision. The house and half the cash would go to me. The other half would be split between my 2 cousins, Diane's kids. Diane herself got $20,000 and some jewelry. It was fair, reasonable, and completely legal. Diane had been furious when she found out. I remembered the Sunday dinner where Gran had mentioned updating her will, how she'd explained her reasoning in that calm, matter-of-fact way she had. "You've been here," Gran had said, looking at me. "Every week. When I had the flu last winter, you stayed 3 nights to make sure I was okay. When the furnace broke, you handled it. That matters." Diane had gone quiet, her face turning that particular shade of red that meant she was calculating something. She'd left early that day, claiming a headache. In the months since, her visits had become more frequent, but different in character. She'd started bringing up Gran's forgetfulness, pointing out little things. "Mom, you already told me that story. Didn't you ask me that yesterday?" Creating a narrative, I realized now, building a case. The first thing I did after leaving the courthouse was drive straight to Gran's house. It was Thursday afternoon, and I knew she'd be home from her physical therapy appointment. She'd had a knee replacement 5 months earlier and had attacked her recovery with typical determination. The physical therapist had told me privately that she was his most motivated patient. When I pulled into her driveway, I sat in my car for a minute, trying to figure out how to tell her. The afternoon sun was hitting the house in that way that made everything look peaceful and permanent. Her garden was blooming. She'd planted those roses herself in April. The porch furniture was arranged exactly as it had been since I was a kid. Everything about the scene screamed competence and continuity. I grabbed the court documents and headed inside. Gran was in the kitchen making tea when I came in through the back door. She took one look at my face and set down the kettle. "What happened?" I put the papers on the kitchen table, and she picked them up, fishing her reading glasses from where they hung on a chain around her neck. I watched her face as she read, saw the confusion shift to shock, then to something harder. Anger, maybe, or hurt. She read the entire thing, all 43 pages, while I sat there with my hands folded on the table. When she finished, she set the papers down very carefully and looked at me. Diane did this? Her voice was steady, but I could hear the betrayal underneath. This says I don't know what day it is. It says I've become a financial risk. She tapped the page. It says she's worried about me. I reached across and touched her hand. Gran, this is garbage. You know that, right? You're the sharpest person I know. She nodded slowly, but I could see her processing. The hearing is Monday, I said. 4 days. We need a lawyer, a good one. Gran stood up and walked to her desk in the corner of the living room. It was an old roll top that had belonged to her mother, and she kept it organized with the same precision she applied to everything. She pulled out a folder and handed it to me. Inside were bank statements, organized by month, her checkbook balanced to the penny, medical records from her doctor, including a cognitive screening she'd done as part of her annual physical 3 months ago. Score. Perfect. At the back was a sheaf of papers clipped together. I've been keeping track, she said quietly, of Diane's visits, what she said when she said it. I started noticing a pattern. The notes were dated, detailed, and damning. Diane visiting and asking leading questions about Gran's finances. Diane suggesting that Gran should sign some papers to make things easier. Diane bringing up the idea of a power of attorney, framing it as a safety measure. Gran had written down everything, including her responses. She'd been meticulous because she'd sensed something was wrong. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. She shrugged. I thought I was being paranoid. She's my daughter. I kept telling myself I was imagining things, that I was being unfair. She gestured at the court papers. But I wasn't imagining things, was I? I shook my head. No, Gran, you weren't. We sat there for a moment, and then she straightened up. Okay, we need a lawyer. Do you know anyone? I didn't, but I knew someone who would. My friend Kevin worked as a paralegal at a mid-size firm downtown, and he'd helped me out with some legal questions when I bought my condo. I called him from Gran's kitchen, explained the situation in broad strokes, and asked if his firm handled this kind of case. We don't, he said, but I know someone who does. Olivia Brennan. She's an elder law specialist, does conservatorship disputes, estate planning, the whole deal. She's tough, she's smart, and she doesn't lose. Want me to make an introduction? I said yes before he'd finished the sentence. Kevin called back 15 minutes later with an appointment set for the next morning at 9. She's moving some things around to fit you in, he said. She's good people. You're in the right hands. I thanked him and hung up, feeling the first small flicker of hope since I'd read that motion. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the little moments I might have missed, all the warning signs I should have seen. Diane showing up with papers for Gran to sign. Diane asking detailed questions about Gran's accounts. Diane taking photos of Gran's medication bottles. I'd walked in on that once, and she'd said she was just trying to help keep track. Every interaction took on a new, sinister meaning. I'd thought she was being attentive, concerned, but she'd been building a case, documenting evidence, constructing a narrative of decline where none existed, and I'd been too trusting, too naive to see it. I lay there in the dark, my mind racing through scenarios, until finally, around 3 a.m, I got up and started going through my own records. Text messages from Gran, photos, emails, anything that might prove she was competent, aware, engaged. I made coffee and opened my laptop, starting with the most recent messages and working backward. The texts were brief but coherent. Gran confirming dinner times, asking about my work, sending photos of her garden. Nothing earth-shattering, but nothing confused either. The photos told a better story. I had hundreds of them on my phone. Gran at her bridge club, smiling with her friends. Gran at the library volunteer event, organizing books with perfect precision. Gran at Christmas, hosting dinner for 12 people with a menu she'd planned weeks in advance. Every image showed someone engaged, present, capable. I started organizing them by date, creating a timeline that contradicted every allegation in Diane's petition. Then I opened my email, and that's when I realized what we really had. What I found was better than I'd hoped. Gran and I emailed regularly. She'd learned to use email a few years back and had taken to it with enthusiasm. We'd exchange messages a few times a week, sometimes about nothing, sometimes about practical things. I started reading through them, and a pattern emerged. Gran was clear, articulate, funny. She'd email me articles she'd read, comments on current events, questions about my work. She'd forward me recipes she wanted to try. She'd send photos from her bridge club with captions that were sharp and witty. The emails were detailed, coherent, and showed someone with a mind that was firing on all cylinders. And they were dated. Time-stamped. Proof that she was exactly who I knew her to be. I screenshot every single one, going back months, and saved them to a folder. When I finally looked up, it was 5:30 in the morning, and I had over 200 pages of documentation. Attorney Olivia Brennan had an office on the 4th floor of a building that smelled like old wood and ambition. She was in her mid-40s, with short dark hair and the kind of direct eye contact that made you sit up straighter. Gran and I laid out everything. The motion, Gran's notes, the medical records, my collection of emails. Brennan listened without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When we finished, she sat back and tapped her pen against her teeth. "Okay," she said. "First, the bad news. Your aunt filed this motion properly, and she's got the hearing scheduled. We can't stop that. But here's the good news. She's got to prove her case, and from what you've shown me, she doesn't have one. The burden of proof is on her to demonstrate incompetence. What we need to do is make damn sure that burden crushes her." She smiled, and it wasn't friendly. "How do you feel about playing some offense?" Brennan explained the strategy. We'd file our own motion contesting the competency petition, supported by the evidence we'd gathered. We'd get Gran's doctor to testify, along with a neuropsychologist who could administer a proper cognitive assessment. We'd subpoena Diane's documentation and tear it apart piece by piece. "Most importantly," Brennan said, "we're going to make the judge see your grandmother as a person, not a case file. She's going to testify. She's going to show the court exactly who she is." Gran nodded firmly. "I can do that." Brennan turned to me. "And you're going to walk the court through that email trail. Every message, every coherent thought, every demonstration of capacity. We're going to bury her case in documentation." She paused. "There's one more thing. Do you know if your aunt has any kind of financial motive here?" I explained the will. Brennan's eyes lit up. "Perfect, that's motive, that's the story. We can use that." Brennan spent the next hour walking us through what to expect in court. She explained the burden of proof, how competency hearings worked, what questions we might face. She was thorough, almost clinical in her preparation, but I could see the fire underneath. She'd handled cases like this before, she told us. Elder financial abuse through conservatorship manipulation is more common than people think, she said. Family members see an estate, see an opportunity, and they convince themselves they're helping when really they're just helping themselves. The courts are starting to catch on, but you need airtight evidence. She tapped the folder containing our documentation. "This is airtight. Your grandmother kept records. You kept emails. That's unusual. Most people don't have this kind of proof. And that's what makes these cases hard to fight. But you do. That changes everything." She looked at Gran directly. "The judge is going to see you as a person, not a statistic. That's our advantage." Over the next 3 days, we moved fast. Brennan got us in front of Dr. Raymond Thorne, a neuropsychologist with 23 years of experience in cognitive assessment. He spent 2 hours with Gran on Saturday morning, putting her through a battery of tests. When he came out of the examination room, he looked almost amused. "Your grandmother just scored in the 96th percentile for her age group," he told us. "Her recall is excellent, her reasoning is sound, and her executive function is better than most people half her age. If she's incompetent, I need to know what she's taking so I can prescribe it to my other patients." He agreed to testify. Gran's primary care physician, Dr. Lisa Nguyen, also agreed to appear, bringing with her the cognitive screening results from 3 months earlier. "I've been treating your grandmother for 8 years, she told me over the phone. "She's one of my healthiest patients, mentally and physically. This is nonsense." Dr. Thorne explained his findings in more detail when we met with Brennan later that afternoon. He'd administered the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, the mini mental state examination, and several executive function tests. Gran had answered complex questions about current events, solved mathematical problems, recalled lists of words after delays, and demonstrated spatial reasoning that would challenge someone decades younger. "The pattern I see," he said, spreading out the test results, "is someone who's maintained cognitive engagement throughout their life. Your grandmother reads, does puzzles, maintains social connections, manages complex tasks. That's what keeps the brain sharp. There's no evidence of decline here. None. In fact, I'd say she's showing improvement in some areas compared to normative data from previous decades, probably because she's actively working to stay mentally engaged." He looked at Brennan. "I can testify to all of this with absolute confidence. This petition is baseless." Sunday night, 24 hours before the hearing, Brennan called an emergency meeting at her office. Diane had filed a supplemental brief, adding new allegations. She claimed Gran had given away money to a stranger who'd shown up at her door. She claimed Gran had left the stove on multiple times. She claimed Gran had gotten lost driving to a familiar location. Each claim was specific enough to sound credible, but vague enough to be hard to disprove. I felt the anxiety creeping back in. "Can she just add stuff like this?" I asked. Brennan frowned. "She can try, and we can refute it. But this is concerning. Wow, she's escalating. She knows her original motion is weak, so she's throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks. We need to address each of these claims directly." She looked at Gran. "Did any of these things happen?" Gran shook her head firmly. "No, none of it. I haven't given money to anyone. My stove is fine. I don't get lost." We spent the next 2 hours going through each allegation, point by point. The supposed stranger Gran had given money to? That was me. Gran had written me a check for my birthday, $200, properly noted in her checkbook. The stove incidents? Never happened. Gran had electric burners with automatic shutoffs anyway. The getting lost story? Pure fiction. Gran drove herself to physical therapy twice a week, 15 miles each way, without incident. The physical therapist, Robert Kowalski, had even commented on how reliably punctual she was. Brennan made notes, pulled together documentation, prepared cross-examination questions. "This is good," she said finally. "These allegations are specific enough that we can prove they're false. That's actually better than vague concerns. When we demonstrate that she's lying about concrete claims, it undermines her entire case." She looked at both of us. "Tomorrow is going to be intense. But we're ready." For each false claim, we'd assembled specific counter-evidence. The birthday check? Gran pulled out her checkbook, showing the entry with the date, amount, and notation, "birthday gift." Her carbon copy matched what I'd deposited. The stove? We had photos of her electric range with its safety features, plus a letter from the appliance company confirming the automatic shutoff functionality. The driving incidents? Robert Kowalski had provided a letter detailing Gran's attendance record. She'd never missed an appointment, never been late by more than 3 minutes, never shown any signs of confusion or disorientation. He'd added a personal note. "In 15 years of practice, I've worked with hundreds of elderly patients. Many do show cognitive decline. Your grandmother isn't one of them. She's sharp, engaged, and asks more intelligent questions about her treatment than most people half her age." Brennan arranged all of this in a binder, tabbed and organized. "When Drummond brings up these allegations tomorrow, we're going to bury him in contradictory evidence," she said. "Every lie gets exposed immediately." Monday morning arrived with the kind of cold clarity that makes everything feel surreal. Gran and I met Brennan at the courthouse at 8:30, half an hour before the hearing was scheduled to start. Gran had dressed carefully, a navy blue suit, her hair done, minimal jewelry. She looked exactly like what she was, a dignified, competent woman who had her life together. We sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, and I watched other families filing in for their own hearings. Some looked resigned, some looked desperate. We probably looked angry. At 8:50, Diane arrived with her lawyer, a man in his 60s named Arthur Drummond. He had the look of someone who handled a lot of these cases, efficient and detached. Diane didn't make eye contact with us. She sat on the opposite bench, talking to Drummond in low tones, occasionally glancing at Gran with an expression I couldn't quite read. Concern, guilt, calculation, maybe all three. The bailiff called us in at 9 on the dot. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, more like a conference room with a judge's bench. The Honorable Teresa Whitfield presided, a woman in her late 50s with gray hair and an expression that suggested she'd heard every story twice. We took our seats. Gran and I on one side with Brennan, Diane and Drummond on the other. Judge Whitfield reviewed the case file, looked up at us, and said, "This is a petition for conservatorship based on alleged mental incompetence. Mr. Drummond, you're representing the petitioner. Ms. Brennan, you're representing the respondent. I've read both briefs. Let's proceed." Drummond stood up, straightened his tie, and launched into his opening statement. He painted a picture of a woman in decline, struggling with everyday tasks at risk. He spoke about Diane's deep concern for her mother, her reluctance to take this step, her sense of duty. It was smooth, practiced, and utterly false. Brennan's opening was sharper, more direct. She spoke about evidence, documentation, and the burden of proof. She outlined what we'd be presenting: medical testimony, cognitive assessments, proof of capacity. She mentioned the emails. "Your Honor," she said, "the respondent isn't just competent, she's exceptional. What we're looking at here isn't a case of cognitive decline. It's a case of inheritance interference." Drummond objected immediately. "Your Honor, that's inflammatory and unsubstantiated." Judge Whitfield held up a hand. "I'll decide what's substantiated, Mr. Drummond. Continue, Ms. Brennan." Brennan nodded. "We'll let the evidence speak." Then came the witnesses. Drummond called his first aboard a woman named Barbara Kent, who identified herself as a friend of Diane's. She testified that she'd visited Gran once and had observed confusion and memory problems. Under cross-examination, Brennan tore her apart. "When did this visit occur? How long were you there? Can you describe specifically what you observed?" The woman floundered, contradicted herself, finally admitted she'd only been there for 20 minutes and had never met Gran before. The next witness was worse for Diane's case. Drummond called one of Gran's neighbors, Robert Fletcher, who testified that he'd seen Gran looking confused while getting her mail. Brennan asked him to describe the incident. "She was standing by the mailbox for a while," he said. "Just standing there." "And you interpreted that as confusion?" "Well, she wasn't doing anything." "Mr. Fletcher, have you ever checked your mailbox and then stood there reading your mail?" He paused. "I guess so." "So standing by a mailbox reading mail is now evidence of dementia?" Judge Whitfield actually smiled at that one. Fletcher backtracked, admitted he'd never actually spoken to Gran, had no idea what she'd been doing. It was becoming clear that Diane's case rested on innuendo and assumption, not facts. Then Drummond made what I realized later was a tactical error. He called Diane to the stand. Diane testified that she'd been deeply worried about her mother for months. She described incidents above. Gran repeating stories, forgetting conversations, making poor financial decisions. She talked about finding the house in disarray, about Gran missing appointments. She was convincing, I had to admit. She spoke with the kind of concerned sadness that seemed genuine. Brennan let her talk, taking notes, occasionally nodding. When it was her turn to cross-examine, she stood up slowly. "Ms. Morrison," she began, and I noticed she used Diane's married name, not her relationship to Gran. "You testified that you've been concerned about your mother for several months. When did these concerns begin?" Diane thought. "Around October, I think. October, 6 months ago." Brennan consulted her notes. "And yet, you didn't file this petition until 6 weeks ago. Why the delay?" Diane shifted. "I was hoping she'd improve." "You were hoping dementia would improve on its own?" "I was hoping I was wrong." Brennan moved closer. "Your mother updated her will in March of last year. Are you aware of the contents of that will?" Drummond stood up. "Objection, relevance." Judge Whitfield looked at Brennan. "Where are you going with this, counselor?" "Establishing motive, Your Honor." "Proceed." Diane answered carefully. "I'm aware she made some changes. Specifically, changes that reduced your inheritance significantly. She had her reasons. And you were unhappy with those reasons?" Diane's face flushed. "I thought they were unfair. Unfair enough to petition to have her declared incompetent so you could potentially control her assets." Drummond was on his feet again, objecting loudly. Judge Whitfield sustained it, but the point was made. Brennan pivoted. "You testified that you found your mother's house in disarray. When was this?" Diane named a date in February. And you took photographs? No. You didn't document this alleged disarray? I didn't think I'd need to. But you documented other things. You took photos of her medications, didn't you? Diane hesitated. Yes. Why? To make sure she was taking them correctly. Without her knowledge? Another hesitation. She knew I was concerned. Brennan pulled a photograph from her folder and handed it to Diane. This is one of the photos you took of your mother's medication bottles. Can you tell me what's visible in the background? Diane squinted at it. It's just the kitchen counter. Look closer. There's a calendar visible on the wall. Can you read what it says? Diane looked uncomfortable. Not from here. Brennan retrieved the photo and read aloud. It says doctor appointment 2 p.m. Dr. Nguyen, Bridge Club 7 p.m. Specific times, specific names, written in your mother's handwriting. Does that look like the writing of someone who's confused about their schedule? Diane didn't answer. Brennan continued. In fact, you took this photo specifically to document your mother's medications, but you accidentally documented evidence of her organizational skills, didn't you? Drummond tried to object, but Judge Whitfield waved him off. The witness can answer. Diane mumbled, I guess so. Brennan nodded. No further questions for now. Brennan pulled out a stack of papers. These are your mother's medical records, including her medication adherence tracking. She hasn't missed a dose in 18 months. The documentation shows perfect compliance. So what exactly were you concerned about? Diane didn't have an answer. Brennan pressed on. You also testified that your mother has been forgetting conversations. Can you give me a specific example? Diane offered a vague story about a phone call. What was the date of this call? I don't remember exactly. Was it recent? Within the last few months? Can you be more specific? Not really. Brennan nodded slowly. So you're asking this court to declare your mother incompetent based on a conversation you can't date or describe specifically? Diane's lawyer tried to intervene, but Judge Whitfield waved him off. Answer the question. Diane mumbled something about not keeping track of every detail. Brennan smiled. But you expect your mother to keep track of every detail, don't you? That's the standard you're holding her to. The cross-examination continued for another 20 minutes, with Brennan methodically dismantling each of Diane's claims. By the end, Diane looked rattled. Her earlier composure cracked. When she stepped down, I saw her whisper something sharp to Drummond. Then it was our turn. Brennan called Dr. Thorne first. He walked the court through the cognitive assessment he'd conducted, explaining each test and Gran's results in clear, accessible language. In my professional opinion, he concluded, the respondent shows no signs of cognitive impairment. Her mental acuity is well above average for her age. I see no basis whatsoever for a finding of incompetence. Drummond tried to cross-examine, asking about the margin of error in the tests, whether one assessment could miss underlying issues. Dr. Thorne handled him easily. These assessments are designed to catch exactly those issues, he said. If anything, your client's mother is sharper than she needs to be to live independently. Dr. Nguyen testified next, bringing 8 years of medical records. She walked through Gran's health history, her mental status examinations, her consistent performance on cognitive screenings. I've had patients with actual dementia, she said firmly. I know what that looks like. This isn't it. Brennan asked her about the allegations in Diane's supplemental briefer, the stove incidents, the confusion. I've reviewed my notes from every appointment, Dr. Nguyen said. There's no documentation of any safety concerns, no reports of confusion, no indication of decline. These allegations appear to be fabricated. Drummond objected strenuously, but Judge Whitfield let the statement stand. Then Brennan called me. I took the stand feeling my heart pounding, but I'd prepared for this. Brennan handed me a printed stack of emails and asked me to describe my relationship with Gran. I explained our Sunday dinners, our regular communication, my role in helping with maintenance and errands. Then she asked me about the emails. I walked the court through them, reading selected messages aloud. An email from Gran discussing a news article about climate policy, offering thoughtful analysis. An email where she'd helped me troubleshoot a problem with my car, remembering specific details from a conversation we'd had weeks earlier. An email where she'd planned an entire week's worth of meals, listing ingredients and cooking times with precision. Each email was dated, showing a clear pattern of competence over months. "These aren't the communications of someone who's confused," I said. "They're detailed, thoughtful, organized. She's always been like this." Brennan entered the entire email chain into evidence. Drummond tried to argue that emails weren't proof of competence, that anyone could write a clear email. Brennan countered, "Your Honor, these emails demonstrate reasoning, memory, planning, and communication skills. They directly refute the allegations of cognitive decline. This is exactly the kind of evidence that shows capacity." Brennan asked me to elaborate on specific emails. There was one from January, where Gran had emailed me a detailed analysis of her investment portfolio, explaining why she was shifting some assets from stocks to bonds, given her age and risk tolerance. She'd used proper financial terminology, referenced specific market conditions, and demonstrated mathematical reasoning. Another email from December showed her planning a holiday dinner for 12 people, coordinating dietary restrictions, timing multiple dishes, and managing a complex schedule. "She sent me the menu 3 weeks in advance," I testified. "Then she sent updates as she confirmed who was coming and adjusted for food allergies. She tracked everything in a spreadsheet that she attached to the email." Does that sound like someone who can't manage their affairs? There was an email from November where Gran had researched a medical procedure I'd mentioned needing, found 3 articles from reputable sources, summarized the key points, and asked intelligent follow-up questions. "She was helping me make an informed decision about my own health," I said. "She was acting as a resource, a support. That's what she's always done." Judge Whitfield looked at the exhibits, then at Gran. "I'd like to hear from the respondent directly." Gran stood up carefully and moved to the witness stand. Brennan swore her in, and Gran sat down, her hands folded in her lap, looking directly at the judge. Brennan started with easy questions. Her daily routine, her activities, her health management. Gran answered clearly, with specific details. She described how she organized her medications, how she managed her finances, how she coordinated her physical therapy schedule. She talked about her bridge club, her book group, her volunteer work at the library. She was poised, articulate, and entirely herself. Then Brennan asked the harder question. "How do you feel about your daughter's petition?" Gran was quiet for a moment, and I saw her eyes get bright. "Betrayed," she said finally. "I understand being concerned about a parent's health, but these allegations aren't concern. They're fabrications. She's painted me as incompetent to serve her own purposes." Brennan asked her to explain. Gran took a breath. "After my husband died, I updated my will. I made decisions based on who'd been there for me, who'd shown they cared about more than just money. Diane was upset about those decisions. She started visiting more often, but it wasn't to spend time with me. She was documenting things, building a case. I kept notes because I could feel what was happening." She gestured at the court documents. "This petition isn't about protecting me. It's about controlling my assets." Drummond objected, calling it speculation. Judge Whitfield overruled him. "She's entitled to state her perception of events." Gran continued. "I'm 78 years old, not dead. I have every right to make my own decisions about my life and my property. My daughter seems to think that being elderly is the same as being incapable. It's not." The conviction in her voice was absolute, and I saw Judge Whitfield nodding slightly. Gran wasn't finished. "When my husband was dying, Diane visited twice. Twice in 3 months while he was in hospice. Do you know who was there? My grandson. Every single day after work, sitting with us, helping with medications, talking to doctors, making sure we had everything we needed. When I had knee surgery, Diane sent a card. My grandson took 2 weeks off work to stay with me, drive me to appointments, help me through physical therapy. When I needed someone at 2 in the morning because I'd fallen and couldn't get up, I didn't call Diane. I called him, and he was there in 10 minutes. Her voice was steady, but her hands were trembling slightly. So when I made my will, I made it based on actions, not DNA. I rewarded presence, not expectation. And apparently that makes me incompetent." She looked directly at Diane. "I'm not incompetent. I'm just realistic about who my family really is." When Drummond cross-examined Gran, he tried the same tactics he'd used with other witnesses. asking detailed questions designed to catch inconsistencies, probing for signs of confusion. Gran handled him like she was swatting a fly. He asked her about her daily medications. She named each one, the dosage, the purpose, and when she took it. He asked about her recent medical appointments. She gave him dates, doctors' names, and what had been discussed. He asked about her finances. She cited her account balances from memory within dollars. He asked about the will she'd updated. She explained her reasoning clearly and unapologetically. Finally, clearly frustrated, he asked her, "Don't you think it's possible you're not seeing your own decline?" Gran looked at him steadily. "I think it's possible my daughter underestimated my ability to recognize when I'm being manipulated. But confused? No, I'm not confused at all." The hearing recessed for lunch, and Brennan pulled us into a conference room. "She's going to lose," she said without preamble. "Drummond knows it. The judge knows it. We're winning on every point." I felt relief wash over me, but Brennan held up a hand. "Don't celebrate yet. Drummond might try to negotiate a partial conservatorship or some kind of monitoring arrangement. We reject anything that gives Diane any control. Understood?" Gran nodded firmly. "No compromise." We spent lunch preparing for the afternoon session. Brennan was calling one more witness, our Robert Kowalski, the physical therapist. He testified about Gran's appointments, her punctuality, her engagement with her recovery program. "She's one of my most cognitively intact patients," he said. "She remembers exercises, tracks her own progress, asks intelligent questions about her treatment. If she's incompetent, then 90% of my patients are too." It was damning testimony for Diane's case, and I could see Drummond slumping in his chair. Brennan gave her closing argument with surgical precision. She summarized the evidence of medical records, cognitive assessments, testimony from professionals, the email documentation. She pointed out the lack of any credible evidence supporting the competency petition. She highlighted Diane's financial motive and her pattern of escalating allegations when earlier claims fell apart. "Your Honor," she concluded, "this case is about a daughter who disagreed with her mother's estate planning decisions and chose to respond by attempting to strip her mother of her autonomy. The evidence shows overwhelmingly that the respondent is mentally competent, physically healthy, and fully capable of managing her own affairs. This petition should be denied in its entirety." Drummond's closing was weaker, falling back on general concerns about the vulnerability of elderly people, the importance of caution. He couldn't point to specific evidence because he didn't have any. Judge Whitfield listened to both, then looked at her notes for a long moment. "I'm prepared to rule from the bench," she said finally, and my heart stopped. "I've reviewed all the evidence presented, heard testimony from multiple witnesses, and observed the respondent testify in her own behalf. This is one of the clearer cases I've encountered. The petitioner has failed to meet her burden of proof. Not only has she failed to demonstrate incompetence, but the evidence overwhelming demonstrates the opposite, that the respondent is mentally sharp, well-organized, and fully capable of managing her life and affairs." She looked directly at Diane. "Moreover, I'm troubled by the pattern I'm seeing here. Allegations that appear designed to create a narrative rather than reflect reality. Escalating claims when earlier ones prove unsupported. A clear financial motive underlying this petition. This court exists to protect vulnerable individuals, not to facilitate inheritance disputes through conservatorship proceedings." Judge Whitfield signed an order. "The petition is denied. All costs to be borne by the petitioner." The gavel came down, and I felt something unlock in my chest. Gran reached over and squeezed my hand. Brennan was already packing up her briefcase, professional satisfaction on her face. Across the aisle, Diane sat frozen, staring at the judge's bench. Drummond was gathering his papers, clearly ready to leave. As we stood to go, Diane finally looked at us. Her expression was complicated. Anger, humiliation, maybe regret. She opened her mouth like she was going to say something, then closed it and turned away. We walked out of the courtroom together, Gran, Brennan, and me. In the hallway, Gran stopped and took a deep breath. "It's over," she said, and her voice was shaky with relief. Brennan put a hand on her shoulder. "It's over. You won, and you won decisively." She turned to me. "Those emails were the key. The documentation was strong, But those emails showed the judge exactly who your grandmother is. Clear, engaged, thoughtful. They made it real. We walked out of the courthouse into afternoon sunshine that felt almost aggressive in its brightness. Gran was quiet during the drive back to her house, processing. When we pulled into her driveway, she said, "I need to change my locks, just in case." I'd already thought of that. "I'll call a locksmith today, and we should probably talk to Brennan about a restraining order if Diane tries to contact you." Gran nodded. Smart. Inside, she made tea, the familiar ritual, and we sat at her kitchen table. "I thought she'd win," Gran said finally. "I thought being old was going to be enough to make the judge doubt me." I shook my head. "You were never just old, Gran. You were prepared. You had evidence. You had proof of exactly who you are." She smiled a little. "We had proof. You and those emails. When did you even save all those?" "Friday night," I admitted. "Couldn't sleep, so I went through everything. Thank God for insomnia." We laughed, and it felt like releasing pressure. Over the next week, things settled into a new normal. Gran changed her locks. She met with Brennan to review her estate planning and make sure everything was airtight. She added specific language to her will, stating that she was of sound mind and making these decisions freely, anticipating any future challenges. She also filed a complaint with the state bar against Drummond for bringing a frivolous petition, though I don't know if anything came of it. Diane didn't contact us. I heard through the family grapevine that she'd told people she'd been trying to help, that we'd twisted her intentions, that she was the victim. No one who'd been in that courtroom believed it. The cousins, her kids reached out to Gran separately, apologizing for their mother's actions. Gran was gracious, but distant. Some things can't be easily repaired. The fallout extended beyond just our immediate family. Word spread through Gran's social circles about what had happened. Her bridge club rallied around her, several members sharing their own stories of family members who'd tried similar schemes. One woman, Eleanor, told Gran about her own sister who'd attempted to get power of attorney under false pretenses. "It's more common than people think," Eleanor said at Bridge Club one evening when I was there. "Adult children who see their parents' assets as their own future nest egg. They convince themselves they're helping when really they're stealing." The library where Gran volunteered held a special information session on elder financial abuse, specifically addressing conservatorship manipulation. Gran attended and even spoke briefly, though she didn't name Diane specifically. "Family doesn't guarantee loyalty," she told the group, "and age doesn't guarantee incompetence. Know your rights, document everything, and don't be afraid to fight back when someone tries to take your autonomy." People applauded. Some approached her afterward with similar stories. Gran had accidentally become a voice for a problem she'd never wanted to face. I kept visiting every Sunday. We never talked about Diane unless Gran brought her up, which was rare. The whole incident had left a mark, though. Gran was more careful about who she let into her house, more guarded about discussing her finances. She'd learned that family didn't guarantee loyalty, that vulnerability could be weaponized. It was a hard lesson at 78, but she was still sharp, still independent, still entirely herself. The physical therapist declared her knee recovery complete. She started volunteering more at the library, organizing a reading program for kids. She joined a new book club. She lived her life with the same precision and purpose she always had. And every time I got an email from her, detailed, thoughtful, perfectly proofread, I saved it, just in case. 6 months after the hearing, I got a call from Brennan. Diane had filed an appeal, claiming the judge had been biased. Brennan sounded almost amused. "It's going nowhere," she said. "The ruling was unambiguous, and we have multiple layers of evidence. But I wanted to give you a heads up. We'll need to respond." We did, with an even more comprehensive brief. The appeals court took one look at the case and dismissed the appeal within 3 weeks, calling it without merit and an abuse of the judicial process. They also ordered Diane to pay our legal fees, a significant amount given the appeal. That was the end of it, finally and completely. Gran framed the dismissal order and hung it in her study, between a photo of her and Grandpa and a watercolor painting she'd done herself. "A reminder," she said when I asked why, "that I'm not helpless, and that I chose well." I understood. She meant me, the choice she'd made in how to distribute her estate. the choice that had sparked all of this. The financial consequences for Diane were severe. Between the original court costs, Drummond's fees, and now the appellate costs plus our legal fees that she'd been ordered to pay, the total came to over $68,000. I learned later from one of the cousins that Diane had to sell her car and take out a second mortgage on her house to cover it. Her husband had been furious. He hadn't known she was filing the petition until it was already done, and the financial impact on their retirement savings was devastating. There were rumors of divorce, though I never confirmed that. What I did know was that Diane's reputation in the community was ruined. In a small city where everyone seemed to know everyone, word got around. She'd tried to steal from her own mother. She'd lied to a court. She'd manufactured evidence. People talked. Her dental hygiene practice lost patience. Her social invitations dried up. The consequences were social, financial, and personal, extending far beyond the courtroom defeat itself. A year later, Gran threw a party for her 79th birthday. The house was full of her friends, bridge club ladies, book group members, library volunteers, neighbors, not Diane, not her kids, who'd sided with their mother eventually. But the house was full anyway, alive with conversation and laughter. I stood in the kitchen helping with drinks and watched Gran move through the rooms, talking, laughing, entirely present. At one point, she caught my eye and smiled. Later, after everyone had gone home and I was helping her clean up, she said, "Thank you." I shook my head. "You did this, Gran. You were the one who kept records, who stayed sharp, who fought." "We did it," she corrected. "Those emails, that's what turned it. You being there, documenting our relationship without even knowing why it mattered. That's what saved me." She paused. Love leaves evidence, I guess. The party had been more than just a birthday celebration. It was a statement. Gran had invited people from every part of her life, former colleagues from when she'd worked as a school librarian, women from her church group, neighbors from the block association, volunteers from the literacy program. Each person represented a connection, a relationship, proof of continued engagement with the world. During the party, several people had given short toasts. Eleanor from Bridge Club talked about Gran's strategic brilliance at the card table. Margaret from Book Group mentioned Gran's insightful analysis of the novels they'd read. Robert Kowalski, the physical therapist, spoke about her determination during recovery. Each toast was another piece of evidence that Gran was not just competent but thriving. I realized partway through the evening that Gran had orchestrated this deliberately, not consciously, perhaps, but instinctively. She was surrounding herself with witnesses, with people who could attest to her capabilities. Even in celebration, she was protecting herself. The trial might have been over, but the vigilance remained. Now, 2 years later, Gran is 80. She's still in her house, still independent, still sends me detailed emails about everything from politics to recipes to the birds nesting in her yard. Her mind is as sharp as ever. She updated her will again last month, not changing any of the provisions, but adding even more specific language affirming her competence and her choices. "Making it harder for anyone to try again," she explained. "I don't think anyone will. The legal fees from the dismissed appeal bankrupted Diane's savings. The court's finding that the petition was frivolous has become a matter of public record. She lost more than money. She lost credibility, family relationships, and the moral high ground she'd tried to claim, all because she thought an elderly woman would be easy to manipulate, would be too confused or weak to fight back. She underestimated Gran spectacularly. The experience changed how I think about aging, competence, and family. I've become an advocate in my own small way, sharing Gran's story when relevant, encouraging elderly friends and colleagues to document their lives, to maintain written records of their activities and decisions. I've seen too many cases now, through Gran's community connections and my own research, of family members exploiting conservatorship laws to steal from their relatives. The system is supposed to protect vulnerable people, but it's easily weaponized by those who understand how to manipulate it. Gran wasn't vulnerable in the way Diane claimed, but she could have been if we hadn't had documentation, if I hadn't saved those emails, if she hadn't kept her notes, if we hadn't had access to good legal representation. Many elderly people don't have those advantages. They lose their autonomy, their assets, their dignity, because someone filed the right paperwork and told convincing lies. Gran got lucky. She had evidence, she had support, and she had the mental sharpness to fight. Not everyone does. That haunts me. I still save every email. It's become a habit now, archiving each message Gran sends. They're proof, yes, but they're more than that. They're a record of a mind that refuses to dim, a person who refuses to be diminished. They're evidence that competence doesn't have an expiration date, that being 78 or 80 doesn't mean surrendering autonomy or dignity. They're also evidence of our relationship, of the years of Sunday dinners and shared jokes and quiet companionship that meant something. That meant everything, actually. Diane thought the inheritance was about money. She never understood it was about presence, about showing up, about earning trust through consistent care. The emails proved what the relationship was. And in the end, that proof was irrefutable. Gran was never incompetent. She was just underestimated. And the evidence, all those carefully composed messages saved in a digital folder made damn sure no judge would make that mistake. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I hadn't saved those emails, if I'd been the kind of person who deleted messages regularly, who didn't keep digital records. Diane's case would have been harder to refute. It would have been her word against ours, her allegations against our denials. The medical evidence would have helped, the cognitive tests, but the emails were what made it undeniable. They showed a pattern over time. They showed consistency. They showed Gran's mind working at full capacity, engaging with complex ideas, planning detailed activities, maintaining relationships with clarity and purpose. Without them, I think we still would have won. The medical evidence was too strong, but it would have been closer, messier, more uncertain. The emails were the knockout punch, the piece of evidence that made Judge Whitfield's decision easy. They turned a he-said-she-said dispute into a clear-cut case of documented competence versus fabricated allegations. In hindsight, those emails were everything. They were the difference between a difficult fight and a decisive victory. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.